Hi, I'm Jeff Stark. This is the fifth video of a series of videos that we've entitled Marital Unfaithfulness. You remember in video number 4 that as a Christian counselor who has a client, a husband and wife come in, there has to be a period of time where that counselor has to get into the real details of their marriage and what's going well and obviously what's not going well. But at some point after he gathers a lot of information, has an opportunity to hear from them what's happened, there's going to have to be a discussion as well, what's really the bottom line root cause of a person, for the person going outside of their marriage and committing adultery. Typically what clients will do, the one who commits adultery will very, very often talk about all the things that are going on around him that influenced him and caused him to have an affair. Usually a long list of complaints against his wife, or if it's a woman, a long list of complaints, grievances on the part of the husband, and that's what caused me to go outside of my marriage and have this relationship with this other person. But what has to be established quickly, fairly soon, after gathering all the information about the history of their relationship and so forth and so on, the counselor's got to get down to the reason, what is the reason, the real cause of what causes a person to go outside their marriage. In video number 4, we talked about those things which we call, or I call, contributing influences. And there's usually no shortage of complaints and grievances that the one who is committing adultery will bring up to about the other person and what influenced them and caused them to have an affair. But a distinction needs to be made. It needs to be made fairly quickly, fairly soon, and it definitely has to be addressed in the course of counseling, and that is what really is the root cause. And again, in video chapter 4, we talked about the difference between contributing influences and the root cause, and we identified that there are a long list of contributing influences, but the really, down at the bottom, root cause of a man going outside of his marriage and being unfaithful, or a wife, is because during that marital unfaithfulness, or even perhaps preceding that marital unfaithfulness, was a spiritual unfaithfulness and a spiritual adultery. Or in other words, a man does not commit adultery with his wife, against his wife, without prior or simultaneously abandoning God and committing spiritual adultery. Spiritual adultery is always the root of why somebody commits marital adultery. And that has to be established very, very quickly on in the course of counseling. If that is not accomplished and is not agreed to, you're going to spend many, 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 many hours addressing the contributing factors and influences, but never really getting down to the root. If you want more an explanation of that, you can go back to video chapter 4, and I think that might be helpful to you. Assuming, though, you've agreed with me now and then, that the real root of why I went outside of my marriage and committed marital adultery is because spiritual adultery, then the question remains then, well, then how do I solve this problem? And the way that you solve this problem is not by addressing the marital contributing influences. If spiritual adultery preceded marital adultery, then what you really need to do is fix the spiritual adultery first, and very, very deeply and very, very accurately. And in that way, Jeremiah calls us to understand certain things. Let me go back to Jeremiah chapter 3. Jeremiah is talking to a community of people who have committed communal adultery. They have abandoned God and gone after other countries and other idols, I should say. And God is saying to them that the reason you're doing this is because you're spiritually adulterous. But here's how God addresses this community of people who are committing spiritual adultery and therefore have gone off committing adultery with other countries. Here's what he says to this community of people, Israel, who has committed spiritual adultery. He says this: "Return, faithless Israel, declares the Lord. For I am merciful, declares the Lord. I will not be angry forever. Only acknowledge your guilt. You have rebelled against the Lord your God. Return, faithless people, declares the Lord. I am your husband." So Jeremiah is saying two things that is pertinent to this husband and wife who, the husband in this case, has committed adultery with another woman. What God is calling him to do is to set his marriage aside for a bit and focus on the idea that what needs to be addressed is the spiritual adultery that is really at the root of why he's committing marital adultery. God is saying, you abandoned me, you walked away from me, you turned your face away from me, you turned your back away from me, you walked away from me, and now what I want you to do is return to me. Come back to me. Return to me and I will return to you. Do this down in your heart. He also says this, only acknowledge your guilt. And Jeremiah, by way of God, is saying to the people, when you come back to me, come, but I want you to acknowledge your guilt. I want you to stop making excuses. Stop blame shifting for committing marital adultery. Stop rationalizing, excusing it, and blaming it on your wife. Rather, come back to me, but only acknowledge your guilt. When you come back to me, acknowledge and take ownership that you abandoned me. Acknowledge your guilt. Acknowledge your pride. Acknowledge your stubbornness. Acknowledge the fact that you would not listen to me. Acknowledge to me. Only admit the fact that you turned your back and walked away. When you return to me, acknowledge your guilt. Admit these things to be true. Now, if you return to me, then I will return to you, the Lord says. A very gracious promise. We see this also mentioned in James chapter 4, and James may even be thinking of Jeremiah when he writes to his people and that he's writing to. In chapter 4, he says, you adulterous people, don't you know that friendship with the world is hatred toward God? What's the solution? If marital adultery, the root of that is spiritual adultery, then the beginning solution to that is to address the spiritual adultery. And so James goes on to say in chapter 4, verse 7 and 8, he says, submit yourselves then to God, resist the devil and he will flee from you. Come near to God and he will come near to you. Wash your hands. James is saying the same thing. Come back to God. That's why you've gone outside of your marriage to committed marital adultery. It's because while you were doing that or before you did that, and what preceded that was that you abandoned me and you committed spiritual adultery by abandoning me. And you abandoned me in the course of committing marital adultery. Come back to me. Come back to me. Admit that you were proud. Admit that you were stubborn. Admit that you covered your ears and you walked away from me. Now, God makes a very wonderful promise. It's very dear and very, very precious. God says this, come near to me. Come near to me. You walked away from me, but if you come back to me in your heart, acknowledging and owning the things that you've done to me, us, and the things that you've done to your wife and to your kids and to your family. If you come back to me, listen to what he says, come back to me and I will come near to you. Come near to me and I will come near to you. What a wonderful promise. If I come back to God, acknowledge the things that I've done wrong, maritally and spiritually and otherwise, God promises to draw near to me and restore me and forgive me and wash me and cleanse me and welcome me back, and we can be, and we'll be face to face once again and intimate with each other. Only come back to me, but acknowledging your guilt when you do. Marital unfaithfulness and marital adultery is a very, very complicated issue. It's a very deep issue. It's a very personal issue. And we can restore ourselves fairly quickly when we do so with God, but restoring yourself with the wife that you've hurt and you've abandoned, or the husband that you've hurt and abandoned, that's a much more complicated, it's a much deeper issue, and it's also a much longer issue that has to be addressed. But it can be done. But it's much more difficult, and it's a much longer process as well. And what I would encourage you to do is not to try to do that on your own. Once you've restored yourself to God and you've drawn near to Him, and He has drawn near to you, now it's time for you to attempt to draw near to your wife or to your husband, admitting, acknowledging your guilt and taking ownership for that, eliminating all blame shifting. Why can't I blame my wife? Well, because I did it because ultimately the bottom root cause was I abandoned God and walked away and did what I did because I abandoned him. The process of restoring yourself to your wife is a very deep process, a very difficult process. It's a very painful process. It's one that takes a long time, but it's one that can be done. But I would strongly encourage you not to try to do that on your own. Rather, find a biblical counselor or a Christian counselor who can help you through that very difficult, very painful, and very long process. I guarantee you this, that if you repent and draw near to God, come near to him, he will come near to you. And with his help that you're going to need every day for the next 6 months, 9 months, or 12 months, as you draw near to him, and if your wife cooperates with you and eventually she draws near to you, forgives you, and you guys work through that, you will be very, very different when this process is over. Your wife will be a very, very different wife when this process is over. Your marriage will be a very, very different marriage and a much, much better marriage having gone through this very difficult but nonetheless restorative process. But the point is, you're going to need, don't try to do that on your own. Find a competent Christian counselor who has experience in these matters, biblical counselor, I should say, and let them use things that they've learned to help you in this process. Should you like to have me to help you with this process, I am available. There's a number that you can call, 215-481-9878. That will put you in touch with me. I'll return your phone call. We can get acquainted over the phone, and we can meet face-to-face, or perhaps we can meet over the internet by way of FaceTime or Skype. But I have about 40 years of experience in helping many, many, many couples to work through this successfully, and I would be happy to help you as well. And that would be the way that you would be able to get a hold of me. Were you interested in me trying to help you and your spouse to work through this? I pray that if you happen to be a couple that's struggling in the pain of this experience, that you would be restored to God and be able to be restored to one another. I pray that God will help you to do that. Let me know if I can be helpful to you.